Islam is now electorally important. And so a lot of governments are trying to make accommodations with it. British government certainly is. The British government actually came up with the most extraordinary formula a few months ago in which it would refer to terrorism conducted by people who happen to be Muslims as anti-Islamic terrorism. You'll have to work out how they came to that formulation, but that shows the kind of contortions into which they have got in trying to cope with the fact that there is now a very large and growing electoral basis for political Islam in several Western European countries, and it grows all the time.
But because I already mentioned the word satirical, I will just tell you, if I lived in England and I cooperate with a lot of people who do live and work there, if any such legislation that equates attacks on religion or religiosity with hate crime or with racism is ever enacted or attemptedly enforced, I will certainly demand from the Department of Public Prosecutions that the next person who refers to a man who blows up a Shia mosque with its congregation in Iraq, a person who describes that person as an insurgent, be arrested for Islamophobia. I think that's the very least we can do. For those who deliberately, the only people we know of in the world who deliberately set out to kill Muslim civilians every day, and in the most gross way, and the most, if you like, it's not a word that's easily in my mouth, but in the most profane and blasphemous manner, at their devotions, on their pilgrimages, in their houses of worship, tearing and bloodying their holy books and their holy places, are the Islamist terrorists, the Islamofascists. Anyone who describes those people with euphemistic words should indeed be indicted and arraigned, if this law is to mean anything, for inciting and encouraging and celebrating the hatred and murder of religionists. How are they going to like to suck on that, I wonder? Because I'm deadly serious about it. If that's going to be the law, while I campaign for its repeal, and until it's repealed, I'm going to campaign for this application of it. And see how they like a touch of that.
So other than fear in the Islamic case, when we look at this as a broader phenomena, what do you think accounts for the double standard in which how we treat criticism of somebody's religious views as opposed to criticism of somebody's philosophical, political views outside of the realm where we consider them sacred? Or I'm just looking for a way to draw this into.
I still think it's the fear of being accused of racial bigotry,
okay,
which is the ultimate thought crime. If you commit that, then you're obviously flung out of the comity of civilized people. So that's the end, and people are very scared of that. And given the simple truth that large numbers of Muslims in Western countries do come from Asia, it's a very easy accusation to have made against you, and it's one people do fear.
It's a very easy one to defuse, though, that, I think. And incidentally, I don't think racism is a thought crime. The preaching of racial hatred is offence if it's not a crime.
Well, hang on. Should it be a criminal offence?
No, but I mean, it is, and no, I didn't say it should be a criminal offence.
I mean, I always thought that the race relations laws in
it's not what people are thinking.
In Britain in the 60s were actually justified because they ended the posting of notices in boarding houses saying no blacks and a number of other rather disgraceful things. So I'm ambiguous about that, but it is in terms of how we order our society is something you cannot do, and it's something you can't think. The fact that whether that doesn't to call something a thought crime doesn't necessarily dignify it as something which you ought to think.
No, indeed, but it's an utterance question. And when I say it's an offence, I mean it's an offence. It's an offence to me, not an offence to the law. But it can have criminal implications with it. But generally, I think everything should be both thinkable and sayable. And that principle matters more to me than the feelings of anyone who might be hurt by any violation of it. But it should be noticed that again, I'm speaking about the country I know best in Europe, my country of birth, the warnings of what was coming by way of Islamist intolerance, by the way of the importing into Great Britain of communities from the extremely backward and feudal and underdeveloped parts of North Africa and Pakistan. People who were arranged marriages to cousins down the generations, and the terrible consequences such as deformed births that come from our second nature. People like Nadim Aslam, for example, who's written this wonderful book about the Yorkshire Muslim community called Maps for Lost Lovers, or Hanif Qureshi, who wrote My Son the Extremist, no, My Son the Terrorist, My Son the Fanatic, Hanif Qureshi. Monica Ali, the author of Brick Lane, Salman Rushdie, most famously. All of these people were telling liberal Westerners, we come from these Muslim populations. We know what they're like. Don't you let them get away with this. And don't you let them guilt trip you into saying the criticism of this is racism. Don't let that happen to you. All these people are friends of mine. I'm very proud to count them as such. Very important. But all of them, of course, are free from any religiosity of their own, Islamic or any other kind. Regard the emancipation of people from religion as the main emancipation that human mind, human society can hope to experience, which is my own view.
So there.
Anyway, in this country, it's nothing to do with them. I think the reason why I say Lawrence Wright wasn't criticized, Jeremiah Wright wasn't criticized till recently. Al Sharpton can be called in the New York Times, he's always called the civil rights activist. How did he get that to be called that? What has he ever done to get himself called that? Al Sharpton, has he ever done anything for civil rights anyone knows about? Active, yes. Active in pinching himself every morning, I'm going to get away with it again by this time tonight. 4 people will have had me on TV and sent me a limo and called me Rev. He can't believe his luck. All he proves is in this country, anyone who put the word Reverend in front of their name can get away with that. But that's not just a problem of people being reluctant to criticize racism. It is, unfortunately, a criticism of a great man who was murdered 40 years ago, Sweeney, because the decision by almost every white person in America to conclude that what the colored folks like is a bit of shout and holler from the pulpit. They like a good preacher when they're talking about political and social and other kinds of freedom. Has been a hugely retrogressive thing. It's meant that the great black socialists and secularists like Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, the people who actually organized the March on Washington, and did the spade work to get it done, and the groundwork, and got the United Automobile Workers to co-sponsor a great contribution from Michigan, incidentally, are written out of the record completely. It's all preacher now. Preacher men. So anyone who can call themselves that, who can pose as a religious figure, whether it's Farrakhan or Sharpton or Jackson, these frauds and crooks and big mouths and bigots themselves, for the most part, gets a free pass from white society. So it is partly true what Peter says, that it's because of race guilt tripping, but it's also because of a totally exaggerated deference to men of the cloth that's also allowed frauds and crooks like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and John Hagee, and now the wonderfully named Ron Parsley. Is it Ron or Roger Parsley? Rod Parsley, a Woodhousian, new McCain evangelical demagogue in the Midwest, to flourish. Whereas people trying similar sorts of bigotry and demagogy without the prefix Reverend wouldn't have a prayer, quite rightly. Or I mean to say, a chance. Wouldn't be given the opportunity. Would be right, lying to children for a living is a pretty contemptible way, I think, to go through life. And these guys do it all the time, and they get called Reverend into the bargain. Woof. And if they were only lying to the children, when they rape and torture the children, they're only accused of abusing them. What would anyone be called who did that who wasn't in early orders? Be called a rapist or a torturer. Now he's an abuser.
Or an organization.
This is a free pass given to the clerisy. All this should end. The United States should be much prouder of its secular constitution. I'm willing to stick up for it.
Peter, it looks as if a thought is just on the edge of you.
It's staying with it.
Broad pass.
Oh.